Hello, welcome. Welcome back, Enza. It's great to have you back as well. And so excited, Stephanie, to feature you in the research series today, guys. It's a jam-packed time of term. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules, both here. I think we have folks online as well.
I assume we do.
I assume we'll figure that out. Yep, we got 10. There you go. And just a reminder, we have our last colloque of the term next Monday. We'll also be welcoming our new senior research fellows, including Enza, which is really exciting. So we'll do that properly. Next Monday. Stephanie, can't wait for your talk. And thanks as well, by the way. She's been really helpful with the Environmental Commission here in Bloomington, which has been lovely. So Stephanie, thank you. Welcome. Without further ado, I'd love to hear. Bernie, do you have any remarks about the project?
So for those who are in the building,
Yes.
but on Zoom, there are cookies.
There are cookies.
In case you wanted to change your location to get a cookie.
And otherwise, you just have to watch us eat them. There's an extra.
So a brief introduction for Stephanie Freeman-Day. She is a PhD student at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Starting her third year, started this semester. And she studies urban forestry, urban ecology. She is currently has a research award from the Ostrom workshop. And it was just announced last week that she will be an Ostrom fellow for next year. So we're excited to hear about it. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Stephanie. And she says about 25 minutes in practice, and then we'll have about 35 minutes of Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Scott and Bernie, for those introductions. Much appreciated. So I'll launch right into talking about my project, which is Bloomington's Urban Forested Patches, Past to Present, Sustainability, Perseverance, and Governance. This is something I've been working on with Bernie for the past year, along with two research assistants, and that's Gretchen Luchauer and Roshi Sinha. So I'm going to start. Wow, it won't advance. Okay, hold on.
I don't know who else is on the screen. Okay.
That's right. That's right.
Try this one. Okay. This will work better. Okay, good. Let's start out with some basic introductions, because I'm never sure how familiar everyone is with urban forestry as something to study. So we consider urban forested patches as to be tree stands within a city, kind of analogous to what you might find in a rural setting, only placed within an urban setting. So possibly smaller in scale, but also with more factors to consider. So the urban forest is this collection of trees in an urban setting, and important to what we're studying. These include both public trees, city-owned trees that might be present alongside roads or in parks, but also trees in yards and on business property that are privately owned. So there's several sorts of arrangements under which these trees might be governed and managed. Urban forest patches we think of as distinct from street trees because it's a group of trees. Of course, they might include some street trees that may be the edge habitat along the edge of this patch. Urban forested patches have ecological benefits that might be considered to be beyond a group of street trees. They're large trees that have an understory. They can serve as a wildlife habitat or a corridor for wildlife. They provide ecosystem services, and it could definitely be considered that these provide ecosystem services at a greater rate than would be the standard set of street trees. So they're important to consider as part of the urban forest as a whole. And they include, as I mentioned before, both private and public trees. So management of these patches could be quite complex. Surprisingly, research on urban forested patches is emerging. Much of what you might find out there is fairly new research. We were happy to find in this past year a paper by Johnson et al. That first of all defined an urban forest patch, which hadn't previously been defined clearly in literature, and then created a framework from which people could study urban forested patches from a socio-ecological point of view, and then finally ended with a set of research questions that were gaps, one of which pertains especially to our work, which is about governance and stewardship of these urban forested patches. And that's what we addressed in our pilot project last year that you see highlighted Freeman-Day and Fisher that just got published this week, actually, where we were looking at patches on IU campus, which is definitely a smaller setting with less institutional complexity. But we did find patterns of patch preservation and or development of areas that had been patches based on especially what was going on socially during the times. So I did talk about ecosystem services in the last slide, but I wanted to go into a little more depth about those because that is really where this ecological resource we have relates to humans. So there are typically 4 categories of ecosystem services: provisioning, which we might think of as fruit trees or where we get our food or our timber for building; regulating, that regulates the human environment, things like carbon storage or urban heat island mitigation; cultural, so this is aesthetics, historic value or sense of place, stories that people might have from their childhood and moving on to current with these urban forested patches; and then supporting, which supports the ecosystem as a whole, things like photosynthesis and nutrient cycling. These ecosystem services can also be quantified, which is very interesting, especially in terms of when we talk about nature and people. So I'll cite a study that Eric Norman and a group of researchers did in Grand Rapids. They looked at 6 forms of urban green infrastructure, and it turned out that conserved natural areas, which would definitely include urban forested patches, provided the highest economic benefit with stormwater services. And I'll emphasize that this is dollars in meters squared, not cubed. That was the wrong superscript. Sorry about that. But anyway, what that means is that it's not just because they're big that they're providing these ecosystem services, it's because it's also that per spatial unit. So they're a powerful source of ecosystem services for people living nearby. So some background: we approach urban forested patches from, you see the word patch dynamics, which is an ecological analysis method. So it addresses the spatial heterogeneity that you see in settings, both exterior to cities and interior, which can be quite complex. And so to address that, there's some quantification that it goes on with patch dynamics. So you can look at the number of patches in a setting and the number of patch types. Patch types can include forested, they can include developed or built, but also things like grasslands, water. And then you can also quantify the frequency of each patch type. So you can get a sense of the mosaic of how all these patches are interconnected together and how many types and the overall dominance of which type of patch in a given setting. A patch dynamics model might include includes patches that are differentiated by structural and functional criteria, what those patches are made of and what they do. Quantifies features, so the number of patches, as I mentioned before, size and shape, etc. Also recognizes connections, interactions among patches, because patches aren't distinct piles. They're connected, they have edges, they have parts that influence each other, flows of material between, such as water, but also such as seeds and plants, and populations of people. Also allows for temporal changes in patches because they're not static, they're dynamic over time. So we apply patch dynamics to an urban setting. So urban patch ecology takes all of that traditional ecology and places it with people. So this especially stems from the Baltimore School of Urban Ecology, and that's where these researchers created the model you see on the right side of the slide that has interactions in the biotic world, so the living world, the physical world, biophysical things like wind and land, shape and slope, built complex that humans have built, and then the social complex. All of these interact over space and time, and importantly at various scales. You can look at patch dynamics over a long period of time, decades, similar to this project I'm describing now, or you can look at it over a season. You can look at it over a whole cityscape or larger. You can also look at it in a single lot. And so with that, when we consider urban forested patches to be social ecological systems, I know all of you are familiar with the figure I include on the right, but I wanted to go into some of the factors that are specific to urban forested patches within SES. So you can look at the location within the cities, and the boundaries of the patch are important, and what it's next to is important, and what it contains. Whether there's a stream, which I'll emphasize a little more later, or a road that might fragment the patch, and then spatial or temporal patterns, are patches growing or shrinking over time. And then social factors that are related to urban forested patches include property rights, private versus public patches, stewardship, what stewardship is in place, is there any stewardship, and who is doing it, and how are people working together, monitoring of the condition of the patch over time, and then historic land use that can create kind of legacy effects on the condition of the patch. If there were chemical deposits, or also if a patch had previously been farmland, all of this can affect what the patch looks like today. And then we add on some additional ecological factors that were proposed to be included in this model by Vogt et al. That have included things like community and species composition of the patch itself, fragmentation, as I mentioned before, and then disturbances, primarily anthropogenic, but possibly otherwise. So this leads me to the research questions for this project. It's what social and ecological drivers are associated with urban forest patch perseverance or sustainability over time, which governance strategies are associated with success and sustainability, And in what conditions might urban forested patches be considered common folding sources? So to define our study area, first I'll talk about the temporal factor. The time frame is 1939 to present. This is because 1939 was the first aerial imagery that we could get that had a clarity to where we could see where there were forested patches within the city of Bloomington. And then we have that all the way up to present. So about 80 years of time progression there. We're using the urban forest within 2021 Bloomington boundaries. Although we know the city has grown over time, we're still looking at patches that were exterior to the city and what may have happened to them during the study period. We're including patches that are at least an acre in size and 120 feet wide. These are guidelines that I got from the urban forest inventory and analysis as far as what this group suggests to define as a patch in an urban setting. We're looking at city designated parks and informal areas. So this might be multiple ownership areas of land that have at least 20% canopy cover. And where we can find that is the National Land Cover Database. It has 3 categories of forest that include deciduous, evergreen, and mixed. So any of those would have at least that threshold of canopy cover to be defined as such at the 30-meter resolution level. And before we started our landscape visual assessments that I'll talk about a little more later, we had 118 urban forested patches in the city, a little more than I expected. So this little slide of a simplified version of part of our GIS file. So I include the forested areas in Bloomington and the parks in the Bloomington boundary. I also include creeks and streams because you can see that it appears that a lot of our patches are near or with or encompass a creek or stream in the city. The darker areas are parks, and then I have overlaid on top of it the forested areas. So that you can see that some parks may be not forested. They may be used for other spaces, but parts of them are forested. And in many cases, a lot of our patches might surround a park. So it's useful to keep those in there. So methods with data collection, and I'll mention that this is ongoing. So for our social data, we have a survey developed that we'd like to send out to interest groups that of people that may have knowledge about a specific patch or group of patches, either historic or current, and then interviews of people that have even more in-depth knowledge that would like to talk to us more about these patches, and then hopefully referrals from one person to another. And we can do an ownership parcel search using GIS data, not to determine who owns the patch, but more to determine if it was private or publicly owned, and historically over time, how that has changed. Additionally, we'll do archive search, look for records of areas that have been protected or have lost their protection, records of areas that have been cleared for development that have been patches, and perhaps other related data. Ecological data includes the landscape assessments that we began in the past month. So this is a visual assessment where we're looking at patch size, we're looking at canopy cover and dominant tree species, and also things like you can see the photo on the right. Many of our urban patches are heavily used by humans. You can see a trail. We're looking for things like that too, how they interact with using them. There's a possibility we'll do sample inventories of some of our patches to get a stronger sense of tree species and tree size, community size, do these more in-depth assessments. I will mention this is baseline data, the ecological data for future comparison. There is no database of forested patches in the city of Bloomington that we have found. So anything we could collect can't be compared to past directly, but could be used for future comparison. And so we're using a lot of GIS for the early phases of this project. So what we're including is historical and current aerial imagery, and then the National Land Cover Database land classification data that I mentioned earlier, and also a layer of creeks and streams. And for social layers, we're including neighborhood associations. We think that might have some kind of influence on cohesiveness on or monitoring a patch's condition, or designated as an area that the neighborhood itself would like to see protected. City boundary changes over time, if any change of land use may interact with a patch's status, historic area designations, and then city designated parks. Because as I noted, we notice a lot of our patches do include parks that the city has designated as such. So for our methods, the older aerial imagery has been georeferenced, and then we can compare the historic imagery that has forested areas to those that are present visually, and quantified if we are tracing the current forested areas and the past current areas to create these patches. So again, yes, we can quantify patch size, and we can also assess patch proximity or containment of a stream. So I didn't want to include any kind of picture that has all of our GIS layers because that would be so overwhelming. But I do have the forested areas slide that I included before, and then also the historic areas and neighborhood associations. I think this is interesting to look at because we do see, we have not quantified this yet, a lot of patches that are in areas that have neighborhood associations. So we'll see later how that relationship may work. So we have some preliminary results, and I'll mention we have kind of 4 trends to mention. The first is something you'll see throughout all of the slides, that many of our patches do contain or are along streams. And so these are the reference images to begin with. This is the city of Bloomington. That's the 1939 aerial imagery on the left. And you can see the areas that are a little bit kind of fuzzy and modeled that look like they have trees. They do. We looked at that and had a researcher agreement about that. And so the image on the right has the NLCD and is classified as forest. And as I'll mention, contains the areas that are less than 1 acre. It doesn't cut those out quite yet, because we wanted to see what was there entirely. So one thing we're seeing is there are less forested patches downtown, which might be expected because of development that has occurred during this time period. You can see fragmented patches towards the center of town. They're fragmented by streets, but there is quite a bit of forested area there. And then you can see the corresponding blank area on the slide on the right. But there are patches that are still outlying, and I'll mention some that sustain downtown. What I've circled in red, because it's difficult to see, is I use Campus and Dunswoods, which we know had been an area that had been given to the university to build the campus. Dunswoods has all of the buildings circling around it. It was developed around Dunswoods, and there have been some attempts to develop there that have been contested by students and faculty. So we see that in this case, the patches persevered probably because of political will for them to do so. We also see outlying reforested patches. And this was an interesting thing that I didn't think of until we started looking at this GIS. But you can see, first of all, along the stream, as we see, there is some forested area. And then it is surrounded almost entirely by agriculture. But as agriculture moved out of the city, we see that that area has, instead of being developed, really more reforested. So we look at trends, we see those 3 trends that I mentioned, and now we want to get into, well, what's related to those trends, what's leading to those trends, what might be some drivers or some processes. So I think the IAD is an ideal place to start that analysis, and it applies to addressing questions 1 and 2 that I had on my slide before. So I chose not to put the entire framework on the slide, instead to focus on variables that we would consider looking at. So biophysical, such as canopy density changes, presence of a stream, level of nearby development, would that influence development next door, previous land use for the legacies that I mentioned before. Then attributes of the community, such as demographic changes, especially population movements, land ownership changes for either use of land or private versus public land. And then the trends we mentioned in the IU Bloomington or the campus study, pressure to develop versus that to sustain. And then rules, of course, city land use plans, zoning, neighborhood covenants. In some cases, neighborhoods have rules against cutting trees of certain sizes that may go along with kind of a choice to preserve some areas, and monitoring stewardship and what kinds of rules are in place. And then the action arena would be private landowners, city government offices, nonprofit organizations, green space users, city residents, environmental interest groups, probably more than that, but that's the starting spot. And then for question 3, for patches as a commons resource. So I first started thinking about this when I found a paper that came out from Fisher and Steed that was arguing that street trees could sometimes be considered common core resources. And this is because they provide ecosystem services for the community, but there's rivalry in the use of those planting spaces that could be used for something else. So we look at, there is a potential for low excludability, but again, rivalry. And then I kind of went on with that and thought, well, maybe patches are a stronger case as commons resources because of the greater volume of ecosystem services they provide. There's still this rivalry in the use of the land. And then there's an interesting question with the ecosystem services, because I would argue that there is differential access to them depending on the ecosystem service. You're thinking about living nearby a patch, you're going to get a lot more of those cultural ecosystem services than you might if you don't have this spatial access to it. So that's something I'd like to address more in the future. But so the question becomes how to identify which patches might be common core resources, and how to identify what we see, what would influence success and the sustainability and perseverance. And for that, I want to go to the design principles and look at which ones might apply and you can see that would lead to patch sustainability. So I don't want to go too long into these, but between clearly defined boundaries, proportional equivalence between benefits and cost, collective choice agreements, monitoring, graduated sanctions, conflict resolution mechanisms, and minimal recognition of rights to organize and nested enterprises, I would argue that clearly defined boundaries, monitoring, and nested enterprises might be the ones I'd like to look into most as far as an analysis of urban forested patches and sustainability of governance. And this is because I think about the clearly defined boundaries to define, maybe there might be a definition of an area that should stay forested. There might be rules for either use of the space, for tree removal or not removal, for planting, for stewardship, any processes in place that are formal or informal. And monitoring, just if people are watching the patch's condition, if people are watching how people are using it, and this is actively discussed, if there are rules and sanctions, and if users are held accountable for the patch's condition. And then I think of nested enterprises because in an urban setting, there's a combination of private and public land, and people would be working with city. In the case of private land, there are interest groups that some members of the patch and people who are stewarding the patch might be involved in interest groups that may also have some influence over how the patch may be monitored and governed. So as I mentioned before, this is continuing research. It's really only in its mid-research period, I guess. So next steps are to include that historic and social data, look at the processes that I mentioned that are linked with outcomes, sustainability, and perseverance, to look heavily into the role of governance and look into characteristics of patches that have sustained over time. This project will be expanded to Indianapolis, especially given this next year with my fellowship, and will become a dissertation chapter. So we have access to an existing ecological data set. So that gives us a kind of a head start. And then we can start really looking into the governance variables that would be of interest to us. And with Indianapolis, there'll be much more variability in the ecological and demographic variables, which will allow for a richer analysis. So this is kind of a scaling up of work from IU campus, the city of Bloomington, to the metropolitan area of Indianapolis. And then additionally, a dissertation chapter on urban forested patches as common pool resources. And so that is where I'll stop for now. We're excited. Questions?
Fantastic.
Monitor, you're first, Anita.
I have a question, and I don't know Bloomington very well. So it may not be applicable to Bloomington. However, I can imagine it being applicable in other areas, and it may help you explain outliers if you find outliers. And it hinges from my read of your presentation is you presuming that these patches are a positive resource. And it's very possible that some of these patches remain because they were areas that people didn't want to be in. They were horrible terrain, or they were swamps, or they had other things going on in them. And so nobody developed them because nobody wanted to develop them, or they were seen as a nuisance. So I'm wondering if there's a way to account for this sort of lack of interest in the resource or other things within your models, as not that it was preserved because people wanted to preserve it, but it was preserved by you.
I think it's a really good point. And I think it does relate to the fact that of the stream effect, because those are so hard to build on. So is this question of, is the patch there because the land wasn't used for something else, or is it there because people have decided it's important? And I agree with you. I think in some cases the answer might be yes to both of those questions, but it may be yes to only one of them. So.
I had a very similar question, but from a different angle. So I mean, this sounds a bit like, the historic wastelands in Europe that were left behind because nobody really wanted them. And then, of course, you also have the issue, okay, what kind of governance are we really talking about? Is there any governance whatsoever? Is this not rather open access? So I do see a conflict there with using the commons as a governance regime type for this kind of resource. And the other point, I mean, I'm not sure if you can solve it right away, but the other point is also whether you shouldn't take into account the degree of connectedness between the different patches as a quality indicator. I think you to some extent do, but I mean, these are like corridors, ecological corridors potentially. So that could really enhance the ecosystem services the value of it. So yeah, I'm not sure if you can incorporate that.
Yeah, I am very interested in incorporating connectivity because, and I think it's difficult to quantify, but important. So I think, I don't know how to do it quite yet, but I would like to, because I think that again, is a quality factor in a quarter for both ecological resources and for habitat. And then again, also the size of the patch providing the ecosystem services because of the connectivity. And so that does make a lot of sense. And then, yeah, as to your first point, I think it's very interesting to think about the absence of governance, because I think of the same thing with vacant lots that have grown into patches. So, yes, exactly. And is there informal governance going on at those that no one knows about, or are they simply just ungoverned? It's a really good question.
All right, so Jamie's got a question. Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your work. It's just really been really fun to hear about, and it's so dynamic too. And so I wanted to ask, like, how surprised were you about the forest cover that you did find, particularly in these urban areas? Because and that question comes from this idea that I have, that I think as people, we sometimes think that we're essential for things to survive and thrive, or that like it won't happen unless we manage it. And what I found cool about your paper was the number of like neighborhood housing associations that were involved in this process. So neither market nor state. So yeah, I wanted to ask, like, were you a little bit surprised, or were you greatly surprised? What was your response?
That's a really good question. So I'm not super surprised, but more interested in the dynamics of where the patches are and how many there are. And I guess just looking at that visual assessment of over time where patches have come and gone. So, I mean, I was aware of Bloomington's canopy cover percentage, but to see how it's spatially distributed was really interesting to me. And just to know that there are kind of these areas that are patches, are forested patches that maybe people aren't as aware of.
So next is Eric, and then Insa. And Eric Nordman was actually cited as one of your citations in the paper.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was fun to see that. And you were correct on the units. It was dollars per cubic meter of stormwater volume managed. So you were correct. You didn't make a mistake.
Okay, I second guessed myself. Thank you for telling me that.
So nice work. There's a whole literature on spatial ecology indicators that you might check out. In addition to patch size, since you're collecting that information, you can calculate the perimeter to area ratio, the complexity of the patch shape. And some of these can be indicators of how human dominated the system is. So if you see very regular square patches, that's an indicator that's probably, downtown. It's gonna have a different type of ecology than, a more natural patch shape is gonna have a lot crinklier, forget the word that a much more irregular patch outline. So there are lots of them, and you can go crazy calculating them. So don't go too far down that rabbit hole, but it could be helpful.
No, that's really interesting. Do you have a suggestion as to a specific person to look up who's done this research? Or
yeah, I have some literature. I can share it with you.
that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Insa.
Yeah, thanks. I have two aspects I would like to raise a little bit. The one point is about sustainability. It sounded to me as if you rather look at from an ecological perspective. If it comes to governance and how maybe people join up to govern these patches, then it's really also an issue of social governance or social sustainability. So I was wondering first, if you start thinking about it, how you would define sustainability then, and how social sustainability can be measured in fact. So there's some initial work trying to capture that, which is much more tricky as measuring ecological facts, of course. But if you want to look at how different governance forms are organized to deal with these ecological patches, then social sustainability comes in.
No, I think that's really interesting, and I think it would go hand in hand with that ecological sustainability, because especially because of the relationship that the ecosystem services precisely, I guess, and
Yeah.
and how humans and the human system and the ecological system are, I guess, benefiting each other. So yeah, no, I like that.
Might be valuable to look at. Yeah, and then I was also wondering about catching up on what Tina said. I mean, do you have an initial idea what different governance forms there are for these patches? Because you mentioned, for instance, as one of your variables, neighborhood associations. So are they in direct link with organizing these patches, or are there just neighborhood associations doing other topics?
That is something yet to be looked into. I know there are neighborhood association activity type things that are like land related, like removal of invasive species, that sort of thing, and community type plantings. Now, I don't know how strong those are in Bloomington, because that's the part of the research that we still need to get into specifics with. But that's more what I'm thinking is, are these cohesive groups, because they meet regularly, are the urban forested patches something that they're interested in working on and with together?
And who else is organizing those patches? I mean, who's governing them?
And I know a lot of the case it is public, and the public parks, it would be that, but in a case where, for instance, a lot of neighbors, there's private property that comes up together and in the backs of everyone's yards are forested. And so is there a case where these people know each other and have agreed that they'd like to keep it forested? I think that's where it becomes really interesting.
Jessica?
I just had a two-finger on this point, which is, I think this is a flat out empirical question and should be like a sub-chapter part, right? Which is like, this seems like a huge gap to me, right? How are these governed? It seems like a really complex problem that you could get a lot of purchase on. So I really think that that would be really useful and helpful, and also could lead you to more generalizable statements about how you can think about governance when the landscape is so essentially networked in some way, right? And so I think that could be really cool. The other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking is IU part of this or not? Like, in other words, the actual landscape of IU, because I know there's been a bunch of tree inventories conducted here, and there's a whole group of folks that, and maybe you're aware of them already, that are doing this sort of thing, and they might have interesting thoughts or ideas or be folks to work with. And then in addition to that, the other group that this made me think of is the community orchard folks. I don't know if you've worked with them. Amy Roche and a few others are super plugged into sort of thinking about the forest resources in Bloomington in a couple of different ways, but they just might be wonderful.
Yeah, no, those are really good suggestions, and especially for outreach, for getting more, because I feel like it's much harder to find that kind of information on informal governance or of interest groups that are doing a lot of work around town, but maybe that's not all in one spot. So yeah, I'll reach out to to especially the orchard. And yeah, the IU connection is interesting, since we just finished that study last year on IUB campus. And so we got some information, but I think there's a lot more to be gotten there, since IU is such a prevalent part of our community.
Wes, and then we'll get Brian after Wes.
I was going to change gears a little bit, but if Brian has something to say on the governance issue, you could go ahead.
Go ahead, Brian.
Okay. Yeah. And if you are staying around after the end of the hour, I could have some more things, because I'm interested in this as a citizen involved in the advisory board for a forest preserve in the city of Greenbelt, where I live, and a commons woodland for the housing co-op. But I think the question is maybe to say a little bit more about the survey that you're planning on doing that will bring out some of these more qualitative things and history of what people have done, and maybe say how you see that informing, the development of your analytic process. And right now, just to flag a couple things briefly, that in terms of identifying incidents and issues, which maybe you're already aware of, but how people react to storms, people starting to get worried about trees falling on their houses and those kind of dynamics, what may be going on with disease. I don't know about Bloomington, whether emerald ash borer is having an impact there, and earlier history. And some of these is kind of challenges and ways in which communities have responded to these. But again, what you see yourself doing with the more qualitative survey and how you would be using that as you go ahead. Thank you.
So yeah, the questions we developed so far have been primarily open-ended. So it's kind of not just to identify the patch first, and then also any kind of change over time that anyone with knowledge of the patch has seen, any kind of action people are taking to take care of the patch, whether it be removal of invasives or replanting, anything like that. And then also how the patch is used by the community, if people are walking in it, using it as like a play area for children, you know, that sort of thing. I hadn't thought about including challenges in the survey, but I think that's really interesting because it looks at, it has as a whole different aspect from what we had previously included, which was pretty much what is it and how it's being used and what have you seen over time. I think the challenges would be an interesting and important thing to add.
Wes?
Yeah, so I have a few comments. The first was about kind of your resolution and your methods. And so I think the way you presented it makes sense, but when I think of like the urban context of Bloomington, and I think about forests, what I think about as well are like those buffer strips in between houses that are in a lot of places, especially in downtown or kind of the surrounding residential areas, which are empty on your map mainly because you were kind of drawing on these 30-meter resolution things. And so what I worry about a little bit is that resolution is just too coarse for where a lot of the trees are in kind of the more residential areas of Bloomington. I think that could be okay. Like that's just a decision you can make and that's very justifiable, but that's something to keep in mind. Especially because I think those buffer trees can be important, right? Like they have clear environmental benefits as well as these forest patches, which may be a little bit more distant from homes.
Yeah, that's a good point, because one of our GIS layers is the straight up canopy layer that would include things like that. And it would be, I think it would be useful to include an analysis, an overlay of the canopy over this 30-meter to see what fractional parts or fragmented sections would be included in the permafrost.
My other comment was, I don't know you spent too much time on this, but I wanted to push back a little bit. But you were talking about the forests as kind of common pool resources. And I think in some contexts that makes a lot of sense. Like when you think about forests as a means of extraction, it seems like a common pool resource. However, I'm not so convinced that forest patches in Bloomington are common pool resources. They seem to more neatly fit into kind of a public good when you think about urban green space. Like, I don't think people in Bloomington are necessarily going to these places primarily to extract firewood per se. I think it's more so these recreational benefits, which aren't very rivaled. But I would love to hear more about what you think about those kind of classifications.
Yeah, and I think that's a hard one because I think of it in terms of, yes, I do think probably they're always, or in most cases could be considered a public good because you're right, there's not the extraction. I think of where I'm going with the common pool is more the space that the forest occupied in the forest themselves. So, and that's where I think it is something that's, I guess, extractable or subtractable. So I think that's where I get really interested in the analysis of that, because I think it's a tricky question.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick follow-up. I think one thing to consider in that is just like the underlying scarcity that even public goods involve. So like when I think about how much public good City of Bloomington will provide, well, there's a scarcity in how much funding it has. But it doesn't transform the public good to a common pool resource. And so I would just like keep in mind that there, even though public goods have some non-rival use, like they are still scarce.
Good point, thank you.
So Jet, you're going to follow up on that one?
Just on this point, because I think another approach is to really just be very clear about who the users are and what the actual good is. And you could have multiple ones, right? But that's different if you're talking about a large forested area that people are using recreationally versus ecosystem services that might be provided by such a forest versus use as an extractive site. So I think some of this comes down to, right, like, and we know this from Lynn's work, right, which is that like, depending on how you sort of characterize and define the resource, who the users are, what is actually good or what is being extracted, will then lead you to sort of the most appropriate classification, and then the best way of understanding how and why a particular property rights regime may or may not do a particularly good job managing the use of that particular kind of use.
Thank you.
So Eric, you have a hand up again? Okay, all right. So Jamie, you're next then, because you said you wanted to follow up.
I do. Thank you, Bernie. One was on this idea of using the idea of the commons to grapple with all these diverse pieces. And I'm treading carefully because I know your advisor knows this thoroughly. And he's excellent. But I saw this also, I think, in Diego's work where this comment came up. And I'm beginning to think that commons is the wrong mental model. I wonder if it's a complex order. And then because commons was a specific type of governance system managing a specific type of good in the Ostrom's work. And so, but you've talked about how you have lots of different things, not just the commons. So I wonder, but the commons is a piece of this. So I wonder if you need a higher level mental model, like the idea of a complex order, which I think Vincent would have gotten behind, judging from his scholarship. The other point I wanted to make was this idea of neighbors that came up, and I lost the context, but it reminds me of conversations that I've had at the workshop about being neighborly and about how that can be a challenge these days. And so I wonder if that's going to be an important piece of your work. You know, how to measure neighborliness, or the extent to which being a good neighbor helps support these urban canopies.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, as far as, especially, I don't know how to measure neighborliness, but I think that is an important part of the idea here, is because we're looking at neighborhood associations and they're all different, right? So that's something to think about for sure. And I think about networks and how people are connected right away when you say that. So that's definitely something to put it on my list as something to think about further.
So Tina and Insa and then Scott.
I can't remember whether you mentioned it or not, but I keep thinking that it would be good if you could, and maybe this data already exists somewhere, if you really could find some more specific biodiversity indicators and link that to the diversity and governance regimes. That I think that could be really cool. As you just mentioned at some point, 10, 15 minutes ago, some of these neighborhood groups are involved in, for example, extracting invasive plants. This could greatly affect, for example, the number of seedlings of local plants. Similarly, you could also, maybe there's an indicator available somewhere to see what kind of diversity in trees you have, what kind of age they have, etc., or just do a case study on some patches and then link that to governance. I think that could be really cool.
Yeah,
but I'm not sure if it's data-wise really possible.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I know we have them for public trees. And that was part of why we were thinking about doing these sample inventories of the patches. And I like the idea of including these a biodiversity indicator, or something like a Shannon's index or something like that. And also maybe a ratio of exotic to invasive species, or not invasive, the other way around, native to invasive or exotic. So yeah, I like that. And then to connect it with any kind of social indicators.
And in the longitudinal sense as well, because I mean, the effect of removing exotics would take some time, and
Yes,
type of tree depends, also influences the growth speed, etc. So.
It's just a thought, you might have done so. Did you check the IFRI questionnaire? Because they had ecological factors and social factors about property regimes and how it's governed. So they always looked at both data sets, and there might be questions you can use for your questionnaire.
that would be really helpful. I'm not familiar with that.
The IFRI, is that not available?
It is, and it's very long.
Okay.
It's very long. So you
But
have to
the
pick
questions
some.
are wonderful, and I think I totally second that suggestion.
Is it ICFI?
IFRI.
IFRI, okay.
International Forestry Research Institute.
That's for older folks in the workshop who don't know.
I wish Joe was still there.
Jessica would know it.
Yeah.
Scott.
Oh, yeah. No, just a really quick one. This is so exciting, Stephanie. I love it. One aspect maybe we haven't explored much yet is just as Bloomington has expanded over this time period. I'm thinking annexation has obviously been a hot topic lately, but there's been a lot of those. And I'm wondering, depending on your data set, could you look at as annexations get rolled out, what happens to urban forests and those new aspects of those communities? And that's obviously relevant for this new potential, expansion for a couple of these new areas. And anyway, I was just curious if that was factored in at all, or if you thought much about that.
Absolutely, definitely want to. We have a map that has, it's not exactly by annexation. The closest I could get is by census year. So it has 1950 through the present. So we can look at what happened with the patches, especially using the aerial data for at least some of those time periods and get a better sense. The map, I still need to georeference it and make separate layers for each time period, but that's a near goal because I'm very interested in looking at how the expansion might have related with that.
Some attention.
A comment is a lot of the annexation was a barren farmland,
Oh, yeah.
and some of it got reforested after they put houses in. So there's
Good point.
a change there, particularly pasture land. It was abandoned, they put houses in, and then they built a patch. Anita.
So I have two questions here, and I'm merging them together a little bit, and because I haven't quite separated them in my mind, but one of them is that it occurs to me that there are likely differing framings that different groups are using about how they view the resource that they're managing. And some of them may say to the public good, some of them may be thinking about, we need to, from the viewpoint of Bloomington as a whole, and how much there needs to be in terms of land protected within Bloomington, whereas others may be thinking about their particular backyard or what they want for their trails. So everybody's got this different framing that they're using, which is going to influence what are the rules, what are the approaches, what are the governance structures that they have, and they're going to be overlapping within one another. And so it may be useful to think about the fact that there may be both overlapping regimes, but also the different regimes may be for different patches or for different sets of users. And that kind of gets to my next part of the question, which is more of a statement or comment than a question, which is, it sounds like the approach that you're taking is going to be very much this grounded approach where you're going to go out and you're going to survey people and you're going to find out what it is. But you're always limited within a survey about how many questions you can ask and other things. And so it might be helpful to have a few theories or hypotheses that you're going to try to test that will help you figure out exactly what you want to ask in that survey to make sure that you can understand. And so I don't know if you have some of those, but definitely I think that might help you to narrow this down a little bit so that it'll come up at the end where you know what you're going to do with the data once you have it.
That's helpful because there are hypotheses and theories, but not intentionally written in such a way as to direct the survey questions.
They don't have to direct the survey questions, but they'll help you choose between which, when you get to, I've got 100 questions and I can only ask 15 of them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I wouldn't be very intentional about the survey. And it's interesting that you bring up this concept of the framing at different scales, because that fits in so much with the whole scale of urban ecology and of patch dynamics. And I think about that social scale of the different overlapping regimes is a really interesting point that I need to think more on too. So.
You might spend a minute and describe the data set you have in Indianapolis, because it's different in several ways.
Yeah, it's different in several ways. So I know, and Bernie, I might need a little help describing it because I know overview of it, but it was collected by a nonprofit organization that's interested in preserving forested patches that are greater than 10 acres within the city of Indianapolis. It's been collected, I think, over the past about 10 years.
Yeah, they collected them. The data was collected about 2016, and they did only patches, actually 5 acres and larger, but then they said, well, we're going to look at the big ones, 10 acres and larger. This is for all of Marion County, so it's a big area. And then they went and ranked the top 100 biggest. And they said, we want to figure out if they're protected or not. And a nonprofit, they weren't working on this at a great speed. And when they finally started looking at it, they already had lost 5. One was a Walmart. And so then they got scared because they went, wait a minute, we had 100 patches, now we only have 95. Literally a couple of years. And so there's been several major newspaper stories about the loss of patches, the county and the city's not protecting and everything. So we've got access to, we don't have to go and find the patches. We can look at the governance of the patches And we can just work with their existing set, which they made very available to us.
Good indicator of the level of protection. clearly.
That's right. And the ones that are protected, I know they lost one they thought was protected because of road expansion. So, you know, you think you have it protected and then, oh, we're gonna build a new highway spur. Suddenly it's not protected.
Is there variation in the nature of the protection and source of it?
What?
Is there variation in the source or nature of the protection? Is it always city or county level protection?
No, there's actually several that are land trust. And in fact, in Bloomington, we have Sycamore Land Trust has got at least one or two.
Definitely a lot of more woods.
And so there's one woods for sure that's got an easement on it from a Sycamore Land Trust. Yeah. Go ahead.
I had a couple questions about the social data that you're collecting. And one of them is, you mentioned collecting archive historic data. And I'm wondering what that is and what you're hoping to learn from it. And then if I've got time, I've got a follow.
So it would include things like city planning documents, so city plans from any time during our study period, and if there were any provisions in there that or specify what could be done with forested areas or natural areas, park designations, that sort of thing. And then looking over any so the public library has a database of newspaper stories that can be scanned for anything related to land use change or decisions made to protect things like parks or preserve areas. And then also it's a really hard thing to look for, but because it's a wide net, that any kind of controversy over changes in status of land.
So I don't know if you've thought about also looking at like city council public meetings, particularly in planning meetings, but those are often really rich
That's a good,
sources of data for controversy.
that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
And then I was also wondering with the interview, are you doing interviews or are these open-ended questions in an interview setting or in a instrument that you're going to mail or somehow?
So we're thinking of it in two steps. So the first would be a survey that would likely be just electronic, like a Qualtrics survey, that would have the initial open-ended questions for anyone with knowledge about a patch that might be rather general. And then as part of that survey, there would be a question, would you be interested in an interview for more in-depth questions? That would include people that really have a lot of knowledge about a patch or a lot to say about governance or stewardship that wouldn't be as useful in a format of a Qualtrics survey.
Would you then easily get a bias data set with those patches that are actually being governed? You find people for it to actually discuss it, whereas the more open access non-governed ones are not.
It's definitely possible. And so it's something, I need to think through how to avoid that. And because we would also be interested in talking to people, should we be able to find them that know about a patch that no longer exists?
Jessica.
To help with that question, I think starting with your GIS data and then saying, okay, this is what I know about these places. Can I then think about what the variation in governance types might be from what I know? So maybe a general sort of like just going about the community and trying to figure out in a qualitative way, like what the sorts of governance are, and then using your map to make sure that you, to essentially get a sense of how biased your sampling frame is going to be, right?
Yeah.
Because then you at least, I think you're always gonna have this problem, but understanding the extent and degree of it, I think using GIS data can be really helpful to know that, because then you have a sense of how small or how poorly representative, right, your sampling frame is based on the sort of possible set of cases.
Yeah, and I think about that bias in terms of spatial considerations, if but like location, if they're all clustered together, but also yes, in terms of social considerations and also yes, patches that have had various fates. So yeah, no, that's a really good point.
I mean, wouldn't a lot of those be privately owned? And could you go to the city hall and track property ownership over time and try to reach out to people through
Yes.
those records?
Yes, there is a GIS file that has the property ownership. I've looked through that before, and I think that'd be a very good way to get to hopefully be able to find Yes, a sample site or sample group of people.
I mean, if you're looking only at a small amount, a handwritten letter mailed to them might actually, rather than a typed form letter, might actually get them very interested in talking to you.
Make it more personal. Yeah, that's a good point.
Scott.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Just a quick one. Just in terms of, governance, I feel like you almost have to bifurcate like the IU campus from the rest of Bloomington, just because there's so many eccentricities with how we manage, these resources here. I'm sure you're already thinking along similar lines, but once you move to Indy, I'm wondering maybe it's worth thinking of something similar for IUPUI's, campus, and even Eagle Creek. My goodness, that's a heavy lift. I just wonder, I'm sure you haven't really thought as much about that yet, but in terms of lessons learned from the Bloomington experience, I'd love to hear kind of what you have in mind there too.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I do have in my mind this bifurcation of IU versus the city, because I think that the structure of the governance is very different as the university versus a more diverse group of actors, right? And yeah, in Indianapolis, I hadn't thought about that yet. I hadn't got that far, but you make a good point with IUPUI and with several other there are enclave cities within the city that we'll need to think through how to work with them. So
Marion County is massive.
that makes us very fortunate that we have the ecological data so that these social questions can be better addressed. So.
So we'll let you close. Any comments you'd like to make at the end to close with the group?
Really, I just want to thank you all for listening and helping me further develop this project. I've been really happy to be working on it over the past year and more excited to expand it further. And so I was most excited to present and just get all this feedback so that I can direct my work over the next several months. So thank you, everybody.
Ryan said he wants to stay on and talk with you a little more, and we'll hang